Hereafter, Our Sister, a Pride and Prejudice variation, inspired by Jane Austen, written by Marley Joy Hawkins, and read by the author. Prologue, a very different story. 1793, Hertfordshire. As your narrator, I thought it would be far too ordinary for such an extraordinary story to begin with the beginning of the beginning. Before we step a little further back in time, I think we must just glance at the moment everything changed for our heroine. It was the end of June, 1793, when Mr. Thomas Bennet of Longbourn received a letter from his neighbour.
Bennet, I hope this letter finds you all well. I received this evening an express from town announcing the death of my respected father, Charles Bingley. My mother and sister are in need of my presence in London. I must support them through their loss, and of course make all necessary arrangements. If it were merely that, I may have returned in a fortnight. I will, however, be likewise needed to oversee Bingley Brothers' interests in town. My uncles and cousins manage the mills well enough in Yorkshire, but they need someone in London. I have spent nearly 4 years attempting to make a good show at farming, only to discover I have as little skill as inclination for the activity. I am well suited to the business of negotiating the sale of superior textiles, and I find that I long to return to my former life. Netherfield was my father's dream for Charlie. I need to be away from the house and all the loss and failure that are attached to it. Grief has compelled me to share more than I ought, I think. It matters not. I cannot make arrangements quickly enough to take the children with me, and it is my hope that your good wife will continue her attentions to my little ones in my absence. It may be some weeks before they join me here. Once they do, I intend to find tenants for Netherfield, until we are able to return. I fear that will take several years. Here is yet another imposition I dare to make on your goodwill. I am unsure if I will return at all before that time, so will you make my excuses to our kind neighbours? I enclose my address in London should you require anything. Your grateful neighbour and friend, etc., Louis Bingley, 683, Mercantile Row, Cheapside, London.
Mrs. Bennet was very happy to do what she could. However, she had been unable to interact much with the children herself for nearly 2 months. She was increasing again, and very ill this time, which, she comforted herself, was a certain sign that she would deliver an heir. August arrived, bringing news that a governess and 2 nursemaids would be sent the following Monday afternoon. Though still too ill to leave her room, Mrs. Bennet decided that the children should spend their last summer morning together, to say good-bye. Old Annie, having chased away her 3rd new assistant, would attend Jane and Elizabeth alone. 2 of Netherfield's young nursemaids brought the children to a meadow that lay between the 2 estates. They were spreading rugs and complaining that London servants is no better than good plain country folk. Caroline was safely stored in a basket and entertained by Louisa with peekaboo. Charlie kept looking out for Dany and asked the nurses 1,000 questions as he waited and watched. 10 long minutes after his arrival, there she was! He forgot about the questions he was so eager to have answered, and found Jane smiling up at him. He rushed past any general greeting, and instead began informing her about all the things he had not yet learned. Caroline and Elizabeth were placed on a rug, each with a toy in one dimpled fist. Lizzie had a ball, and Caroline a rattle. They faced each other, babbling adorably, until Caroline discovered that one of her hands was empty. Deciding immediately that she would like very much to hold the ball, she reached for it, but Elizabeth balked at her audacity, holding it fast. Caroline, offended by her shocking incivility, bit Lizzie's hand. Refusing to be intimidated, Elizabeth bit her right back. Caroline howled. The girls were separated, and Lizzie was chastised by old Annie for being a naughty little puss. This was when, being clever enough at 7 to know what was good for her, Louisa finished nibbling a cherry tart and made an exceedingly momentous decision. Rising from the rug, she rescued Elizabeth from her undeserved scolding. Still busily chatting, the nursemaids paid them only passing attention, and old Annie did not object because just then Charlie and Jane started walking towards the stream. Louisa returned to the rug, and reaching out with her free hand, she invited Caroline to grasp it. Having taken as much enjoyment from tearing flowers apart as could be expected from the activity, she was ready for a change and happily joined her sister. Louisa led them just out of the nursemaid's sight, where the babies could not be seen behind the brush, leaving only her own sun-reddened hair visible. The good old nurse was well behind her, loudly correcting all the wisdom Charlie was sharing with her charge. Intending to take the nice baby to London and leave her naughty little sister behind in Hertfordshire, Louisa led them to damp soil. Squishing fingers through velvet mush kept the babies happily entertained, while she removed the dress from Caroline to exchange it for Elizabeth's. It was only a matter of minutes before they were both dressed and very soiled. Hands, faces, and hair were all decorated with mud. As soon as the two girls toddled back with Louisa, the Netherfield staff gasped, and the uneaten picnic was hurriedly packed away. Annie, who would never admit that she had trouble with her eyes, took the child in Elizabeth's bonnet as she fussed. "Two young women, and they couldn't be trusted to watch a pair of babes and keep 'em out of mischief. Here I am with my hands full, with Charlie talking so, and Jane almost drowned." Unlike her little sister, Jane was perfectly clean and dry, adding a little doubt to the veracity of the good woman's statement. Fortunately for Annie, no one was listening to her in all the busyness of packing. When it was done, and the Netherfield coterie climbed into the cart, neither of the nursemaids was eager to risk sharp little teeth on this last morning, and they allowed Louisa the doubtful privilege of holding the baby in Caroline's bonnet. Grumbling about the need to hurry, and fussing over their soiled charge, it wouldn't do to have the superior Londoners catch sight of her in such a state. They made their way to Netherfield as fast as the ponies would trot. I wished to suggest to them that expecting small children to leave a picnic unsoiled belongs only in a work of fiction, but I dare say they would not have listened. Appearing in that muddy and dishevelled state, Miss Elizabeth Bennet shocked the occupants of Netherfield's breakfast parlour. The London staff, having arrived early, had just finished refreshments when they saw the supposed Caroline, and immediately took over. They washed and dressed her, deciding country maids could not be trusted even with that simple task. Less than an hour later, the children were bundled into the chaise. Charlie lisped out, "How dolly to have Lizzie come!" Louisa hesitantly smiled and explained in a whisper to the nurses, "Charlie calls Caroline Linny." They had only half listened because they were busily arranging the baskets and bundles. The only responses she received were a vague, "How lovely," and one "oof" irritated utterance that likely referred more to a pinched finger than Charlie's poorly timed observation. A few weeks later, when everyone was settled in at her grandmother's house, Louisa did begin to feel a little bit guilty about her deception. To avoid her French lesson, she confessed it to the governess. "Louisa, dear, it is impossible that no one noticed. You may be sure they would have corrected the blunder immediately, and do remember that the nurse from the other household was present too. Besides, a mother knows her child. She, even if no one else noticed, would have come to remedy the mistake. If indeed it had occurred, this little girl is undoubtedly your sister. Think no more about it." So Louisa did not. Her governess made a lot of sense. As the years passed, whenever the hazy childhood memory crossed her mind, she smiled at her younger self, supposing she could carry off such a thing. And dear Caroline, who could imagine their family without her? Eventually, even those hazy memories ceased to intrude on her peace. Author's note. You may choose to leap forward into the tale by beginning with Chapter 4, passing by the formative years of our misplaced Elizabeth Bennet, and joining her just before her entrance into society. I mislead you, I must confess, with talk of leaping forward. There is our hero who must be introduced, a season in London to suffer through, and we will meander a little while in country lanes before we reach the hilltop where the forest ends and Pemberley spreads her arms in welcome. For those who want the full story, we will start in 1789, when the Bingleys moved to Netherfield.